This is one of 9 pieces of legislation which will implement the government's ICT policy, which they introduced in their white paper in October 2016. The white paper was greeted with horror by the majority of the industry players and the media, because it hardly reflected at all the green paper that had come before, or the industry consultations. After the white paper, the industry and the minister went behind closed doors for about 6 months. The big 6 network operators negotiated separately with the minister and the Department of Telecommunications. And as a result, we got the ECA Bill, which is we have now. Again, the industry has reacted with shock and horror, because the bill does not reflect the good faith negotiations which the industry players believed they had with the department and the minister, and the bill itself contains the same bad policy elements that the white paper had, including the WOAN, etc. Now, that's as far as I'm going to take it, because we have 2 excellent speakers this morning, and they're going to take you through in detail. We have with us a guest speaker. I'm delighted to welcome again Adrian Schofield. He is the program consultant of the Information Technology Professionals South Africa. This is a 60-year-old body with over 9,000 professional members, promoting professionalism, transformation skills, and capacity development in the IT sector. Adrian is also the vice chair of the Institute of Professional Practitioners Partnership, IP3. And again, that promotes good practice within the ICT industry. Following Adrian, we have our well-known Executive Director, Leon Louw, who will speak about why the bill in its current form is unlikely to succeed at all, that it is void for vagueness, and is likely to end up in years of litigation, which is not good for the industry, the economy, business, consumers, anyone who has anything to do with mobile computing. So with that, I'll hand over to Adrian, and welcome, and thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning. I think for many of you, I am already a familiar face. And before I talk about what the Institute put forward in its reaction to the ECA Amendment Bill, I'd like just to contextualize my relationship with the industry and with those who would attempt to legislate it. I've been around the South African ICT sector for 30 plus years, and I've filled several roles in terms of representative bodies. I've been president of the Information Technology Association, which represents some of the vendors, and I have been president of what was then the Computer Society, is now the Institute of IT Professionals South Africa, representing the practitioners in the sector. And through those involvements, I've been a fairly close student of the government's attempts to regulate, legislate the ICT sector in general, and the telecommunications subsector in particular. So I am not a friend of ANC policy. I'm going to make that very clear right up front, because I firmly believe that in spite of the good words that have been used in their policy statements, when it comes to actually turning those policies into legislation, they actually change their direction, and instead of facilitation, they focus on control and limitation. So having given that as my opening statement, I will take you through the comments that the Institute officially made to the department in reaction to the publication of the amendment bill. And I have to agree with Jane's opening remarks that there was a fair amount of consternation around the difference between the sentiments expressed in the Green Paper and what came out in the White Paper. And then having had those industry interactions following the White Paper, we thought that there would be some change in attitude in certain aspects of the amendment bill, and that was not to come. So just briefly on the points that we raised to the department, and this really goes in the sequence in which they appear in the bill, just because that was the easiest way of dealing with them. The first thing that came up was the question of allocation of spectrum and the intention for the responsibility of that to move from the independent regulator to the minister, and I will come back to that. But we made the point that the expertise for allocation of spectrum is very technical, and we do not expect our ministers to be good at that sort of stuff. Ministers are supposed to be looking at the needs of people and directing policy accordingly. Then we talked about the way in which the wireless open access network was defined, because it isn't a wireless open access network, it's a wholesale open access network, simply because the network depends on both cable and wireless to be implemented, and that we felt that if there was to be reference to a WOAN, that it should make it clear that it was talking about a wholesale network. Our next concern was whether or not the ministry, the department, understands the telecommunications market. They put some words into Section 2 of the Amendment Bill which we felt were based on a misunderstanding of how the market has evolved, and were intended to create the misconception that market forces are in some way unreasonable. Market forces around something as massive and complex as telecommunications are incredibly difficult to understand. Of course, there is the basic notion of the capital investment and investors needing return on capital and looking for the best returns they can get. And in the environment that was created by legislation for telecommunications in South Africa, it became, what shall I call it? I'd be hesitant to call it a gravy train, but it became a very lucrative path to be on, to put a mobile network into South Africa in competition with the aged, incompetent fixed line network that Telkom had. But think back, when that all started, the powers that be, including some of the investors, thought the market for mobile telephones in this country would peak at 500,000 phones. 500,000. They never understood that this country, having suffered the inability to communicate with each other and the outside world, depending on a Noma-Assap leaf twisted pair, would grasp the opportunity to get a mobile phone the way they did. And it didn't matter that it was expensive. It met a need that was there to be met. And the operators, particularly companies like Vodafone through Vodacom and MTN, saw the opportunity and were prepared to invest to make it happen. They cannot be blamed for the way the market developed. Can't paint them as some sort of evil person because they took advantage. That's what business does. So I wanted to reinforce that this understanding in government of the market doesn't exist. And it's made even more clear because the bill itself contains significant reference to the need for market analysis and reporting. Several times it says we need to analyze the market. Why are you then producing this piece of legislation about a market that you patently don't understand because you don't have enough information? Okay, moving on a bit. The next area that we commented on was the need for rapid deployment. The bill talks about facilitating rapid deployment of infrastructure. Great. But there is a very ambitious plan to collect data and analyze it before deployment can happen. And as I made a point later on, that means it isn't going to be rapid. It's going to be held up because we don't know what we need to know. We looked at the bill's comments on equity ownership and repeated what's been said before, that we're disappointed that government overlooked the opportunity to fully align the transformation obligations of licensees with those of the broader country. We have legislation around broad-based black economic empowerment, including all of the definitions of who the beneficiaries should be. Why is it different in the regulation of licensed operators? Sure, those regulations came in before the BEE Act, but there have been many opportunities to align those definitions. They've missed another opportunity to do so. Then if we talk about the WOAN, if anything turned out to be an unfortunate acronym, that one, it's very closely aligned to moan, and we are moaning about the WOAN non-stop. I've already made the point about wholesale instead of wireless, and the opportunity to put some sanity back into that proposal came when the Big Six had their negotiations behind closed doors. How closed are they? We all know what happened. And they thought that they had introduced a flexible approach to it, but that apparently has not happened. And we as an institute firmly believe that the opportunity to share infrastructure on a more equitable basis is there without having to mess with the law. We already have mobile virtual network operators, so they are operating the retail level on top of a wholesale network. And one of the interesting things for me was the support of the internet service providers for the WOAN on the basis that it would enable them to have a fair crack at the playing field. What they didn't say is that there are 400 plus internet service providers already making a fairly reasonable living out of a wholesale arrangement with the existing network. So what were they hoping for by the introduction of a WOAN? Lower input costs, obviously. But there is no proof anywhere that that is what they would get. None. And if there are already 400 successful competitive ISPs, what are they complaining about? The current network serves them pretty well. And of course, the whole issue around whether or not the spectrum that everybody requires would be available once the WOAN was put in place. Yeah, rapid deployment, just to reinforce what I said earlier, it says that the Rapid Deployment National Coordinating Centre, there's a wonderful set of letters, would take up to 24 months from its establishment to develop the processes to enable rapid deployment. So 2 years before you even start implementing processes to deploy things. That's not rapid deployment, that's just putting off the evil day for as long as you can. One of the other phrases that comes in is under section 20M, I think it is, whether that provides a disincentive to invest in infrastructure, because it says all users within a defined property or premises must rely on the facilities of a single access provider. Okay? So your walled housing estate, your office block, this group of offices here, would only be allowed to contract one access provider. And if that access provider goes offline for any reason, you're dead. No communications whatsoever, no alternatives. Who on earth dreams up these things? I'm going to not too worried about some of this stuff. Oh, one really interesting point was around license duration. Existing licensees have been given long-term licenses for very good reasons. They had to invest massive amounts of money, and the only way they were going to get a return on investment was to be able to generate income over a long period. That's perfectly acceptable on big infrastructure projects. That's why we enter into long-term rental agreements when we build office blocks or housing estates. Okay? So suddenly it says no matter what the duration of the license, it will be renewable annually. Excuse me? Does that mean my license comes to an end every year and I have to now negotiate with you to get another year out of it? I know as an independent consultant, I have an annual contract with my client. And at the end of that year, I have to negotiate whether or not I can provide services for another year. That I understand. But if I've signed for a license that expires in 2028, why must I now be subject to an annual renewal process? Doesn't make sense. So not only unconstitutional, it's illegal. I think there was a section where it said the authority, I presume ICASA, must impose universal access and service obligations on existing licensees. Again, I have entered into a license agreement, a contract with government that says they give me this and I give them that. How can we now put a piece of law in place that says, we're going to give you a whole bunch new obligations because the ones we thought we had didn't work? Okay, then on to the matter of what is high demand spectrum. You know, the only reason that we have high demand spectrum is because government messed up the allocation of it in the first place and has spent 10 years not implementing the migration of digital, terrestrial television to digital signals. If we had overcome that, when we should have, then we wouldn't have a fight over spectrum right now. We would have operational trials of 5G. We would have LTE rolled out on a far wider geographical base than it currently is. So I don't buy the argument that somehow government has to interfere in the process of allocating spectrum that is useful for certain types of communication and for reaching certain types of market. Okay, I've already said I don't think the minister should be involved in technicalities of radio frequency allocations, and it should stay with the authority. And if the authority lacks whatever expertise it needs, it must be allowed to engage it. And then just, I think, to finish on, because I think one should always be amused by something in law, even though it's pretty miserable sort of a subject. In the section on roaming amongst SADC countries, there is a phrase in clause 42A(1)(d) that prices should not be too excessive. Now, my understanding of English says that that is okay for prices to be excessive, but they mustn't be too excessive. And who's going to decide that? So with that, I want to thank you for listening. I have opinions that probably the Institute doesn't allow me to express because I'm standing here on their behalf, but they do give me a fair latitude to say things the way that I want to say them. So, yes, we should have telecommunications legislation. It should be entirely focused on facilitation, not control, and it should be in the hands of people who understand the contribution that ICTs should be making to the economic growth of South Africa. And I spend a lot of time trying to assist people to focus on that side of the issue rather than whether or not it's too expensive to make a telephone call to a friend of mine. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise, or you may like to let Leon say his piece and then ask both of us, but that's up to you.
Do the second presentation and then have the question Q&A at the end. Thank you very much, Adrian. That was thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Just to put a bit of background here, Adrian's submission, the presentation, and our own were given at the ECA consultations, which took part in early March. It was a two-day event with the department. The minister didn't attend. The DG and his team did, including the guy who was responsible for drafting the bill. And there were over 40, I think there were 43 submissions to the department, and over 30 organisations gave a submission. And the overwhelming majority was against the bill in its current format. Some thought some parts were good, and but overall, the majority, I think you would agree with that, the majority were, and yes, you were there as well, anti the bill. So now Leon will present our own submission, but also talk about the legality of the vagueness of the bill as it currently stands. Thank you. Leon?
Thanks, Adrian. You make it somewhat easy for me to proceed with my part. And unashamedly, I will not be diplomatic, and if I were, you'd all be disappointed. If you can't handle straight talk, then this is the time to leave. If you can handle robust talk, then stay and let's have it. But I'm going to be very critical of this, more critical and more stridently critical than I would normally be of proposals, because this one has a very dodgy history, apart from dodgy content. It's dodgy twice over, sort of double layers of dodginess. So I'm going to address some of that, and as you can see over here, I'm going to argue, let me just see if I've got the light right, yes, that it's probably void for vagueness. I'm going to give that first, because this is an element that is not yet, as far as I know, been aired in public or properly debated, is whether this is actually legislation which would pass constitutional muster, and if it were challenged in the Constitutional Court, what is the court likely to find? So I'm going to spend a bit of time on that because it's new. Let's say this is the new bit. And the rest is that it's a terrible idea, failed idea, anti-progress idea, and some would argue, I mean, the whispering in the corridors, when you say why, people say, well, it's corrupt. This is just a way of creating business opportunities for Pels and I don't know much about that, but nonetheless it is a widely held whispering in the corridors. I'm going to start off with the single word that sums up all of economics, and if you can just remember this word alone, I've arranged with the Wits Economics Department that you can get a PhD in economics just by going and saying this word. If you say this, you get your degree. And so just remember it. This is it. If you can remember this, you understand essentially everything about economics and law and legislation. And this is the word that is completely ignored in this bill and in the white paper. It's as if this doesn't exist. In other words, as if no economist has had anything to do with it, or no lawyer. And this word is simply the acronym for there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, and Tanztafel. Now, this bill presupposes lots of free lunches. It presupposes benefits at zero cost on steroids, on a grand scale, as if you can just wave a magic wand and get incredible benefits, free and cheap access without anyone having to pay. So let me delve into the new bit. This is, if for media people, would be, I suppose, the most newsworthy part, because the rest has been said. And I'm indebted to Martin van Staden, who's with us here, a lawyer who's done some work on this. But I take entire responsibility for what I say. None of this is attributable to him, other than that he helped me clarify my thoughts. And we're only at the early stages of analyzing this. The WOAN, the wireless or wholesale, depending on what you mean, open access network, is undefined in any coherent way in the bill or in the white paper. It's more defined in the white paper than the bill, but the bill has plunged it into deeper confusion, and it's plunged into even deeper confusion by comments by the Director General, who at this consultation, when asked what does it mean, he basically said, well, we haven't decided, we must sit down and talk about it, and it's some future decision. So now there's a bill before Parliament that wants to create a wireless open access network without the DG himself knowing what is meant by it, and whether it's going to be private or public and private, or only government, whether it's going to be a monopoly, not a monopoly, compete, whether it's going to be run on commercial lines, not commercial lines, who will manage it and own it, will it be a listed company, won't it, will it be some sort of co-op, will it be some kind of new entity created in law? He does not know, and nobody knows. Nobody in this room can know, because this has never been clarified. So we're talking here about creating a giant organization, potentially. It could be very small, it could be massive, it could be as big as all the network providers combined, or it could be some little outfit that operates in a few remote valleys where there isn't yet service provision. And there aren't many of those, because 98% of population already has coverage. So nobody knows, and he does not know, and he said he does not know. I was quite startled that he actually had, if I may say, the temerity to tell the people in the consultation that, well, we don't really know. We haven't decided exactly what we mean by it, but nonetheless we're going to make a law about it. And so now can you imagine the Constitutional Court being asked, is this real law? Is this law with any kind of degree of certainty? Does it meet any of the criteria required in the Constitution for something to be a law? I would imagine, I would bet money on it that the Constitutional Court would say, I'm sorry, this can't, in any objective sense of the word, be considered a law. It goes further. Oh dear, why is it doing that? It's sort of leapt ahead here. I'll get back to what's missing there for some reason. Sometimes PowerPoint does that. Well, no, I think I have to show what precedes it. Is it going to appear? There we go. It talks about all these terms which Adrian referred to: wireless open access, wholesale open access, general open access. What do they mean? I could go into each, but for example, the word general is meant to mean access to the network that is effective, transparent, and non-discriminatory. So it says there must be general open access, that's obligatory, and that's how it's defined. Now you tell me, what on earth does that mean? And under what conditions do you not provide? Is it who decides if it's effective, not effective? Who decides if it's it doesn't say the minister decides, or the government, or the department. It's just a law that ends there. Now, Hugh Lane is a formidable lawyer sitting in the audience, and you know, I'd like him to tell me whether he thinks this is some kind of justiciable, which is the word you would use in law. In other words, could you bring an action that a court could make a ruling on regarding such vague terms? What does transparent mean? You know, general open access transparent. Does that mean you have to disclose your secret industrial technology for equipment that you bought abroad that's subject to patent rights, etc., etc.? What does it mean in this context? It's really unknowable. And then it says it has to be cost-based. The DG, when he's asked, does that mean you have to supply it at cost? Or does it mean cost plus a profit? Cost plus a fixed markup? What does it mean? He said, well, we haven't decided that yet. So the word cost-based, which is like critical. I mean, this is so profound and fundamental to the whole notion that these ISPs, independent service providers, are going to get cost-based access to the networks. But the minute the DG himself says, well, we actually don't know what we mean by that. We'll decide that as we go along. And let me make a point that was not being made as far as I can tell. What the cost is actually incalculable. There is no accounting methodology whereby you can say the cost of a particular bit of spectrum in the Tugela Valley is X, because it's part of a whole complex bundle of spectrum allocations and accounting. And if you say to an accountant, what is the cost of a particular bit of spectrum in the Tugela Valley in some village there, you know, it could be the village of Nkandla, for example, there is no accounting way to calculate it. It's not a knowable number. So you can't even, so you have a law here that says you have an unknowable number, and you don't know what you want to do with that number. Do you charge that number, or do you add something to it, or do you make a profit, or whatever? Now you can imagine cost-based has been assumed, by the way, by most people to mean no markup, no profit. Well, that'll just, of course, be an end to all investment, not just to investment at running a 10 billion rand a year of rollout of new technology and network, but maintenance of that network will stop. If all you can recover from cost is the network itself will sort of break down within, you know, 2 or 3 years or whatever it is. I don't know how long it survives if no one maintains it. But if you have what the industry assumes it means, no markup, but I don't think they're entitled to make that assumption. In fact, the DG said maybe it does mean a markup. We don't know. Then you can expect the networks to slowly just wind down, and we'll go back to using, you know, 10,000 Telkom phones or whatever it was in the bad old apartheid days. Then the high demand spectrum, so-called. It's completely incoherently defined. It says high demand spectrum means where demand exceeds supply. What on earth does that mean? You know, does the demand for bananas at Pick n Pay exceed the supply of bananas at Pick n Pay? I don't know. I suppose since there's some on the shelf, it means supply exceeds demand. If there are none on the shelf, it means demand exceeds supply. That's typically how an economist would think about it, but it's a completely incoherent statement. Where demand exceeds supply, that's called high demand spectrum. In economics, just for what it's worth, there is no such thing as a surplus of demand or supply. There's a wrong price. In other words, there's no surplus of Rembrandt paintings or shortage of Rembrandt paintings. The price for them is simply correct, and supply meets demand. So economics knows no such thing as demand exceeding supply, other than if the price is regulated. In which case, just don't regulate the price. Then supply and demand will never exceed one or the other. And they will always gravitate towards so-called market clearing price. Then also it says where the spectrum is fully assigned, it's called high demand spectrum. What does that mean? All spectrum that is assigned anywhere is fully assigned. That particular wavelength is assigned. That's it. You don't have it sort of half assigned. You can use every second peak on the wavelength or something. It's just meaningless terminology, gobbledygook, I'm afraid to say, and I would like to know if Hugh Lane agrees with me. He probably hasn't looked at the bill itself, but I think these are just very, very elementary entry-level Law 101 points. They're not even complicated, not even debatable. Then it talks about virtual entities, and I won't go into them, but what on earth is a virtual entity? It's either virtual or it's an entity, but these virtual entities, whatever they are, these ghost-like things that float around somewhere in the spectrum, have powers and obligations, very considerable powers and obligations, but nowhere does it tell us what is this thing called a virtual entity. And then spectrum itself that will go to this supposed WOAN, which we don't know what it is, and it will go to cost, we don't know what the cost is, and there'll be virtual entities sort of hovering around, we don't know what they are. But what spectrum will it get? Will it get all the spectrum? That was originally presumed to be what the white paper said, or will it get only high demand spectrum, which itself is indefinable or vaguely defined, or not defined in the bill? Let's put it that way. Someone like Adrian could define it, but that's not what's in the bill. Or does it mean the spectrum released by digital migration, or the spectrum that is currently unassigned, or spectrum that's reassigned or reallocated? Well, you know, you just don't know. So this is the degree of vagueness. It's really quite beyond comprehension. The WOAN is an entity, and this is how, to the extent it's defined at all, an entity. It doesn't say whether it's a company, a club, a government corporation, a partnership, a PPP, an IPP, whatever it is, nobody knows. It doesn't say, but it's called an entity, whatever that means in law. I don't know if you can tell us if there's a legal coherent meaning of the word entity. A hue, after all, is an entity. So, I mean, there's an entity right there, and even you're an entity, and this is an entity. So we've got lots of entities around, and one of these entities is going to have these awesome powers, which will redress skewed access by a few. Now, what does that mean? 98% coverage. So only a few, you know, that's a hell of a big few, let's put it that way. That's a lot of few. If that means access by a few. This is going to be sort of fixed. We're going to have, you know, 99% instead of only 98, or, you know, maybe if we're very lucky, 100%. That, by the way, is by population, not by area, which is important because I was driving around last week in the northern remote parts of KZN, in the Shushului, Kuzi, Manzini area, visiting schools and looking at, in fact, as it happens, IT training in remote rural villages, amongst other things. You know, there sometimes, wherever there are residences, there's coverage, and when you drive over the hill where there isn't a residence, then you certainly lose network access till you get to the next little settlement. And I can tell you that from personal experience. But anyway, it's going to redress barriers to entry. What does that mean? The only barriers to entry are regulatory. The bill doesn't redress them, you just discontinue them. That's what you would do. You would stop being a barrier to entry. That's the government's simple choice and option. And it would promote service-based competition. We have service-based competition, very effective competition, vigorous competition, which I know because I recently decided to have a new cell phone and a new cell phone contract and looked at it. And I can't tell you how they competed with me. I couldn't stop them phoning me to offer me their new and better service. And when I was threatened to leave one and go to another, I was phoned and said, we're giving you 8 gigs extra data on this, you know, stay with us. And they sort of heaped benefits on me in a very competitive way. And then you're going to promote an environment for open access. Now, what does that mean? I have asked people, in what sense is the existing system not open access? And I can't get an answer. As far as I know, all of the service providers are free to provide service to anyone. And they do with some, and to contract with each other, and they have data roaming and so on. Is that not open access? From all the experts in the industry, I've asked all sorts of people in and out of government. Nobody can tell me why the current system is not called open access. I have been told that there are regulations. The licenses given to the network providers prevent them from giving open access to their network. They have to comply with their license. I haven't studied the licenses, but if that is indeed what the licenses say, then you just remove that restriction and then you have open access. So you either have it already or you allow it. That's how you get open access. You don't need an act and you don't need a new entity of some sort. And then, so what is the status quo? Why is it not called open access? Nobody can tell me. And I continue to ask the question. So the FMF is investigating the legality. Is it void for vagueness? Would it be a lawful bill if passed? And we are commissioning a senior counsel opinion, and we will probably engage in litigation. But we have also been told that at least 2 of the big network, of the 6 now network providers, have themselves commissioned senior counsel opinion on the legality of the bill. And at least one of them has told us, without showing us the opinion, that they've been told that it would not be constitutional and lawful. And in any event, they are ready to fight. So this bill, even if it's passed, will actually not come into effect. All it's going to do is bog down the advance of South Africa's spectacular success story, the cell phone industry, and prevent it ever happening. So whether this bill will ever be instituted is unclear, even if it's passed. And it certainly will be the subject of very vigorous legislation which will prevent it being implemented, we are told, by network providers. And I happened to speak to another one over this weekend who said, one of the prospective ones, who said, we will certainly bog this down in legislation to its death. It will never actually happen. So now I'm going to run through our formal submission very quickly because time doesn't allow too much more. There were 43 submissions to the government, 30 presentations, and only 4 of them to some degree could have been called, 1 fairly passionately in favor of it, 1 half in favor. For example, Telkom said they want this wireless open access, which, as we've had explained, is actually a wholesale open access. It's, for those who don't know, we think it's wireless because our phone is wireless, but in fact the whole network is cables and wires under the ground to all the towers. So it's a wire full, not a wireless network. But nonetheless, Telkom said, we want access to the towers, but don't give anyone else access to our wires, our cables. So in other words, we want access to them, but don't give them access to us. Now, whether that's supporting the measure or not is unclear. It's just saying, look, we would like you to promote our vested interests, which is what you'd expect the 4 to say. They were just 4 obvious and transparent vested interests, nothing really commenting on the benefits to the country or the intended benefits. There's essentially industry consensus, and then, as we've heard, the independent service providers, I agree, are mistaken in their view that whatever this thing is, they kind of have some vague idea that they will somehow be better off if this vague thing somehow happens. But it's not at all clear what it is that will happen and why they think they will be better off. And I think they're greatly mistaken, because what we are likely to see is we will not get 5G rollout, we will not get 4G extended to a bigger country. Let's be clear about this. This is South Africa's most spectacular post-apartheid success. This is number 1. There is nothing else that has happened since 1994 that competes with the success of our telecommunications technology and industry, where we have wider coverage than some first world countries, certainly wider than pretty much any developing country. And if anything, we should say to the rest of the world, come to South Africa and see how we did it. We are the greatest success ever. And you might say, let's do a little bit of tweaking here, a little bit of adjusting there, maybe remove restrictions on license that somehow prevent them from being open access. But to mess with the most successful thing that's happened since apartheid in South Africa just makes no sense at all. And as I will say later, to mess with it with something that has been tried only once in one country, and there are people who will argue that this isn't true, and I would take them on, which is Rwanda, where it's a disaster. Only something like, I think it's 40,000 4G LTE phones. And then there's supposedly Mexico, where the minister interestingly said he'd been to Mexico and seen it working there. He was there 2 years before even the final contract. It's not working, it's not yet instituted. It was going to be some WOAN, some kind of public ownership thing. It's now ended up being outsourced to Nokia. So the whole thing has gone as a monopoly to a foreign company, which has not yet implemented it. So nowhere in the world has this happened, and except in one little country where it's a catastrophe. And so why would we mess up one of South Africa's greatest accomplishments and replace it with something that has never been tried or tested or proven except once where it's been a failure? And you can say Mexico is a failure in the sense that in the end they had to give it to a foreign company anyway. So is that really what we in South Africa want to do? Whereas our companies are such a success, they're going all over the rest of the world, the other way around. You know, we should have gone and taken it over ourselves in Mexico maybe. So there's global consensus. Nobody does this. Everyone wants competing network providers. Nobody thinks you can run any capital investment by the private sector on cost-based, etc., etc. IITPSA, which is, you know, whatever its flaws or weaknesses or inadequacies, I think has actually done a reasonable job. By and large, you know, I think they would have done certain things differently if they had another chance. Not a problem. They were fundamentally against it. They absolutely strongly, quite strongly, I actually must say I've seldom seen one government entity come out with guns blazing against another government entity, in fact its own department, its own bosses, with such vigor. It is really quite an extraordinary thing to see, and a healthy thing. I'm very glad that they felt free to do that. But the idea is to abolish them and to remove the independence of the agency. Now, many people said in the consultation that that itself would be unconstitutional. I can't myself see why, but they argue that the control of wireless, the control of communications and wireless, according to the Constitution, has to be, and broadcasting has to be independent, but I think that doesn't mean the technical infrastructure has to be in. I think there's a difference there. But nonetheless, speaker after speaker said it would be unconstitutional to basically abolish IITPSA and remove its independence. The network providers providing, you know, 10 billion rand investment per annum at least. With a new 2, it might be even more. Looks as if it'll be even more. And whether it's constitutional on the basis of the certainty principle, rationality, the right to trade clause, the property rights clause, the human dignity and freedoms clause, that's clause 1, and freedom of media, speech, communication, transformation, objectives and so on, all of these, it seems, would be violated if it went ahead, even if anyone could work out quite what it means. On competition policy, it says it wants to promote competition policy. Well, the way to do that is to allow competition. The market must be what's called contestable to be competitive. It's not about market size or market share. People complain that there are 2 dominant players. There's nothing in economic theory that tells you that makes it uncompetitive. On the contrary, one market player can be completely competitive provided there's freedom of entry. If you have the only grocery store in a village, you do not have a monopoly unless there's a licensing system. If anyone else is free to open another grocery store, you call that in economics competitive. It's not to do with how many operators there are, what size they are. The socio-economic, sorry, acronym wrongly there, socio-economic impact assessment. There's a bit of a nasty story to this. I was on SABC debating the minister about the bill some time ago, and I said there's no socio-economic impact assessment, which is compulsory by virtue of a cabinet resolution. And he said, yes, it is. It's on the website. Mr. Louw just hasn't seen it. So he made me look as if I'm uninformed. Well, I thought that's strange. I haven't. And I went and looked, and lo and behold, they posted it on the website the night before the radio debate the next morning. So it was a ploy, I should imagine, just to make me feel, to make me look as if I'm uninformed. However, this thing itself is a fake document. It doesn't meet any of the requirements of the cabinet guidelines on how to complete them, and it doesn't pass any. It doesn't meet the requirements of a socio-economic impact assessment. Some of it's PDF, and you can unpack a PDF in layers. And you can see that the original one was in fact started some months before, but the final bits were added literally the day before. And so it was unfortunately a sort of dirty trick. Anyway, I don't know what's happening over here, why this is doing this. Anyway, then there's this talk of universal coverage. What does that mean? Does it mean every square foot of the country, or does it mean 100% of the population? And if that, does it mean where they live, or does it mean where they work, or does it mean the farms on which they farm, or whatever? Nobody knows. And so to move on, the Free Market Foundation, which wants free people, South Africa's greatest post-apartheid accomplishment, as I say, now over 100 billion rands of private investment that cost the public and the government nothing, and is one of the country's greatest ever success stories. There should be spectrum ownership and trading in our view. That is the best way to allocate it. And I'm going to move on somewhat quickly because our time is really up. There are what I call gadfly fallacies. People will say that duplication of infrastructure should be prevented. You heard Adrian talk about wanting one infrastructure provider for this complex, for example. And the idea is somehow that's a good thing, that if you reduce duplication of infrastructure. Well, that's like saying we should have only one restaurant in Sandton, because if we have two, we're duplicating infrastructure, or one shopping center, or one filling station. I mean, nobody argues this for anything else. Well, why did they get away with it with telecommunications? It's completely irrational. You want duplication of infrastructure. That's called competition. And so the bill says on one hand it doesn't want duplication, but it wants competition. Well, make up your mind. And more importantly, there should be freedom of entry. So even if there is one single provider, that's not the problem. The problem is if you don't allow others to enter, which the bill says it wants, and it says it doesn't want. So quite which it is, nobody knows. This idea of spectrum squatting, that unused spectrum, so if you have a certain wavelength, a certain amount of spectrum, and you're using only 75% of it, the idea is that some will be taken back because it's an unutilized allocated resource. Well, that's also false economics. False economics works on the basis of the Coase theorem, is that if there's freedom of trade in any resource, you can presume that it will be allocated to the optimal user. That's what markets are for. That's why you want competition. That's the purpose of competition, is the advancement of the Coase theorem in economics. Then you want auctions are the best way to determine prices, and you want spectrum trade. It's the best way to bring about efficient allocation, and you don't want coercive open access networks versus spontaneous ones. In other words, just allow any service provider to provide open access, and as far as I can tell, they're already free. So we have open access already. I can't understand what what they think is wrong with what we've got. And I'm closing with this slide, which is the three most strident opponents at the consultation were ICASA and the two big operators, Vodacom and MTN. And Shameel Joosub of Vodacom said, the minute you talk about returning spectrum, it makes the entire network useless. Now that's strong language, and you've heard that explained why that would be the case. And he called it the Telecommunication Mining Charter. Now the mining charter resulted in basically the end of investment in the mining industry, and South Africa tumbling from being one of the world's leading minerals producers to a low-level operator, and South Africa completely missing what was called the minerals boom, or the opportunity that other countries took. Godfrey Motsa of MTN provided a really impassioned opposition. I've never seen anything quite like it from a CEO, and we'd hoped to have MTN represented here today. And he accused the government openly of negotiating in bad faith, which we've also heard about from Adrian, that apparently deals were struck behind closed doors. I don't know what they were, and maybe some of the people in the room do. I see some very knowledgeable people with us, which is an honor. And and the government negotiated, made everyone think a deal had been struck, and they all knew where they were going, and then all of a sudden it proceeded with a white paper as if nothing had happened, which had been widely and virtually universally condemned. So we have the resurrection and of the unreconstructed Witty paper, white paper, as if no evidence had been led. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I think we have here something that is extraordinarily serious. This is something that affects every South African. There are more cell phones in South Africa than there are people, and that is because something like 80% of South Africans have a cell phone, and some people have 2 or 3, and the remaining 20% are people who probably just don't want one. They're too young or too old. Very occasionally people will be too poor, so all the talk about it being expensive. I saw a housekeeper in a little village recently in northern KZN, where she had 2 cell phones lying on the counter, and I asked her why, and she said one is MTN and one is Vodacom. And I said why, and she said, well, if the one doesn't work, the other one works. And here's a very lowly paid, very, very modest income person living literally in a Zulu mud hut village with 2 cell phones, and one of them was a smartphone, one of them not. And so this is a fantastic success of South Africa, and we really should not mess with it. We really should cherish it, hold it up as a sample, model to the rest of the world of probably the single greatest post-apartheid accomplishment, other than obviously freedom itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One thing that hasn't been mentioned today is that both Vodacom and MTN said that if this bill is enacted in its current format, data prices will actually rise. Instead of the big pushes, obviously data must fall. And that will be as a result of the lack of investment and the lack of new technologies coming into the country, and the lack of spectrum. And MTN was particularly vocal about that. Without new spectrum being assigned, then data prices will definitely rise. Questions? Duncan, please.
Thanks.
Say who you are.
Duncan McLeod from Tech Central. Just a quick question for Leon on something you said in your presentation. You mentioned you're commissioning senior counsel. Can you maybe talk about the likely process there, and if you file court papers, when you will do it?
Yes, the senior counsel we've consulted is one of the, I suppose one could say, the top 10 counsel in South Africa, and he's happy to do it for us at some sort of discount we could afford, or maybe even pro bono, provided we can provide him with a good junior. And I've asked him whether he would regard Martin as his junior, and he's thinking about that. So that will save us even more money. But as to when we will challenge it, you can, in South African law as it stands, challenge a measure only once it's become an act, once it's passed. In other words, you can't challenge a potential measure. That, by the way, is something which I'm very keen, along with 1 or 2 constitutional experts, to challenge in and of itself. The reason being, they say the government, the courts can't interfere with what the government might do, because it could change its mind, and that's obviously a very good argument. But the problem is that if you wait for the law to pass, the consequences are far-reaching. By the time you get there, you could have avoided billions of rands of investment, or there could have been billions of rands of malinvestment, or government, you pass the bill, then you start challenging it, and in the meantime, big government agencies and corporations and restructuring budget items and so on are created. So we want to argue, maybe in this case, that the implications of waiting are too serious, and try and persuade the court to actually consider interdicting the government against passing a law. That's never been done, and the overwhelming consensus is it can't be done, but it's something we might try to get the court to consider doing in this case, failing which we will publish the opinion in advance, and we will be able to challenge it in court only once it's legislated. My prediction is, by the way, that we won't even need to, because I think you probably know who's likely to challenge it anyway. I think it could be challenged even by someone like ICASA, which will be weird for a government agency to challenge the constitutionality of an act, will be quite conceivable in this case. But certainly some of the network operators and maybe others are likely to challenge it. So we might not even need to, then we can allocate our resources to other important causes, like we want to challenge the town planning laws because they force people to live in shanty towns and slums. So we'd rather have the money for that, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping to hear other questions.
Can I follow up on this one, please?
Yeah, well, please.
Yeah. Can't you challenge the economic impact part of it, which is an obligation before, in order to present a bill in Parliament? You should have gone through what its impact, positive or negative, maybe. Just that part.
Yeah. Just this shows that Trey, who's a good friend of ours and a big cheese in various contexts, is the head of telecommunications in Saki and elsewhere. So yes, Chose, it's a great honor to have you here, and is a good friend of ours. The catch with that is, Chose, it's a cabinet resolution, not a law. So the government doesn't really have to honor its own cabinet resolution. At least we don't think so. I mean, there could be you could bring a case saying, if it's a cabinet resolution, is it in fact obligatory? And the government has set up a whole, as you know, an agency in the planning department to evaluate and pass socio-economic impact assessments. They've published guidelines on the presidency, so it's got a lot of gravitas. We are trying to have this government agency and function supported by legislation that says socio-economic impacts are compulsory as a matter of law. At the moment, I don't want to say only, because of course it's important that it's a cabinet resolution, but it's probably not, as we sit here today, justiciable. So we probably can't bring a case based on the failure to do a socio-economic impact assessment. Although, if I may say to people like you and Martin, let's think about that. That could be an issue. If a government department ignores a cabinet resolution, is that unlawful? That's the question. Nobody knows yet.
It's certainly something worth raising in the media to ask the question. Holding them accountable. Did you want to ask now?
Yeah, yes, please, yeah. My name is Walter Brown. I'm unattached.
Don't you want to come and stand with me here? Yeah, sorry, Walter.
Unattached is other side, by the way. And I'll expose my age, by the way. I still remember the Maitland missing late report of the 1970s or something like that. The link is still missing. And I've been listening to I've taken part in the process, by the way. Made my submission, you know, my original document was done at the last minute, half an hour or something like that. But the one factor that I identified is simply this. Whatever you do, what the Free Market Foundation wants to do, what government wants to do, is not going to solve one fundamental problem. Now, we say people have cell phones. Of course they have cell phones. But now here, I've talked to the statistical office, by the way. We've got about 30.4 million people that are trying to survive on 780 rand a month. Now, let's try to figure out how, out of that amount, they'll pay for any kind of ICT service. And we can't even define that to start off with. You'll say, oh yeah, they've got a cell phone, there's a dial tone somewhere on the way. But if I want to progress, I want uncapped broadband wherever I am, and especially if I'm a poor child. We failed to do that, all of us. Now, I was hoping that I'd talk to Graham. Graham was supposed to be here, because we can. By the way, Adrian mentioned that there's an alternative meaning to the war, the Moan. I've got another one. The war one won't. The won't, basically. We will not achieve the results whatever we do. Now, there's also one critical understanding. Government can't do it. You mentioned, and I agree with you, government does not, no government has the capacity to be able to understand these complex issues. But we are sitting and waiting to complain for government to do something about them. Why don't we be proactive instead of being reactive? We've got the knowledge. The industry has the knowledge. It's got the capacity. It's got the capability. But we sit and complain about laws. By the way, through my travels, I mentioned my age, you know, it's quite a lot. I traveled to a number of countries, including Africa. One of the stunning ones was Liberia. Go and try to fix the network before Charles Taylor took over. Ouch. They had one of the finest ICT policy ever, done by McKinsey. And the state president took all the revenues from the telecom, and you had to ask for permission from the president to make an international focal. That's what I think about policy. And even the laws we're talking about. Whatever you do, they're not going to solve the problem until the industry. Adrian is representing, an advocacy group. MTN was supposed to be here. They're in the forefront. I believe that MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, Telkom, all of them can get together if they want to and solve that crisis. There are engineering solutions. I promise you, I can look at what we've got now and deliver uncapped broadband services to 30 million people at 39 rand a month. That's a 5% of their income, by the way. We can do it if we want to. Thank you.
I think, Walter, we have to accept that history has brought us to where we are. Technologically, it is possible to solve all of these problems. Unfortunately, the relationship between business and government in this sector, I think the same applies in other sectors, but in this sector, is adversarial. It is not cooperative. The South African economy is warped not just by its history, but by the way in which it has developed over the last 25 years. So that we are subject to unnatural forces, not Economics 101, but Politics 9003. We are not able to express ourselves as freely as we would like. So that is why the Big Six chose to have a behind the doors discussion with the ministry when they saw the potential damage coming out of the white paper. They thought they had made progress. The bill hits the streets and they discover that, generally speaking, they have made no progress. Now, why is that? Is it possible that the intelligent people that make up the policymakers had chosen to just ignore what they were told? Or is it that they are still pursuing the policy that has been underlying South Africa's telecoms policy since 1994, which is we want to control what you see, what you say, what you hear through the communications network? If you look at the way this government from 94 onwards has approached communications and broadcasting, you will see that it is all geared towards being able to switch it off so that you cannot learn what you want to learn, that you cannot communicate your ideas freely. I'm saying that because I've been saying it for 20 years. Okay? So it's nothing new to those who are going to see this video tomorrow. I'll probably be out of a job tomorrow. My point is that you cannot bridge the gap between those who are locked in to an ideological course against the realities of 21st century globalized economies. You cannot, unless somebody is prepared to open their eyes and ears. I have to say that we as a country have seized on this year's change. Okay? Lots of new optimism, new hope that we will see some new directions. But you can't just talk to the top of the iceberg. You've got to be able to see that the news is getting down to all of the layers below. And so far, not enough of those layers below have either been changed or have opened their eyes and ears to new ways of thinking. This bill will not see the final stages of Parliament before the election. Did I say that? Okay?
No, I said
Well, I've said it as well. Okay, so let's not panic, okay, because it might never see the light of day if the 2019 elections bring a further shift in political direction in this country. It already has become changed in some significant ways since it was put on the table, and I can tell you it is being changed again as we proceed from here. So what becomes tabled before Parliament should probably go through another consultation process before being put in front of the members of Parliament.
I'll just add 3 points quickly. One is that you know, some of us are old enough, like you and me, to remember the old days when there was a single government broadcasting monopoly, telephone monopoly, even a simple thing like having a Bluetooth earphone on a switchboard was regulated and in fact banned. You had to get a special license for that. So I just want us to remember, compared to the old days, things are pretty good now with private competing providers and instead of a few thousand telephones. The other point is Duncan MacLeod has written to the effect that he has information to the effect that the bill is being rewritten to incorporate some of what came out of the consultation, but I think he said in his column nobody really knows outside yet what that means. And then finally, let me say about uncapped low-cost access. There is already a charter, and I'm not sure of the detail, others in this room will know it, whereby they provide open access broadband wireless to mobile data to schools for education purposes. For some reason, not much of it has happened. But at the school, one of the schools I visited, a high school in the Josini district, literally out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, has an IT center, an IT room, which has uncapped free broadband from one of the service providers, I can't remember which. But the people themselves, the individuals don't, as they sometimes walk up to 2 hours to and from their homes. But so they all have access to that center. The sad thing is there's no teacher in the school who knows how to explain it to them or introduce it to them. So there is uncapped access at school for all of them. And I think for most communities or many communities around the country, in theory, all of them should have it. I think if they literally go and ask for it, they'll get it. I think that's what the deal amounts to. Maybe not, but there is a charter to that effect. I gather that only something like 10% of the schools have taken advantage of the opportunity. This is one, and that's at least a start. And the kids do, you see them sitting around the playground. I went and chatted to a few, and they're doing all their Facebook and everything, and research for school projects in the playground where they have uncapped, free, open access.
Sorry, just to follow on that point.
Yeah.
By the way, have you looked at the children at St. Stithians? And then looked at those children that you just come from? The way they exit and the way they play?
Yeah.
You know what? Success of St. Stithians is welcome. We have to support it because we need that. Yeah. Adrian is associated with the Chomolong Research Center down in Bloemfontein. Brilliant. However, 63% of South Africa's children are completely excluded from that. That, by the way, their successes can add to our inequality, which is the biggest crisis that we face. Yeah. Now, we have to bear that in mind. Saying that, oh yeah, he's got a cell phone, therefore he's okay, is not enough. And by the way, as far as the bill is concerned, if it succeeds, God help us. If it fails, nothing happens. Okay, unless we collectively decide, hang on a minute, there will be another Mahikeng, which is the most recent one around here. If we don't deal with it, I believe we've got to get whatever government does, we can do it. I think we should.
Yeah, well, at the very least, the government should maximize the spectrum available to network providers so they can get more services with fewer towers and infrastructure. They can roll out higher speeds and lower costs. And just remove whatever licensing barriers there are. At least it can do that. That'll bring prices and competition down.
sorry, I'll come to you in a moment. Just a comment on consultation. We've been told confidentially by a Member of Parliament that there are currently 22 bills before Parliament and 6 months effective parliamentary time left this year. So there's a lot of squeezing going on, a lot of pushing going on, and some bills are being pushed through without any public consultation at all. So members of the media might just like to think about that. And,
which itself is a violation of Section 195, which says that all policy has to be preceded by adequate public consultation.
This bill is not going to get to Parliament. For the simple.
Could you say who you are, please?
Oh, sorry. My name is Heather Malcolmus. I'm from ZWBDC, South African Web Business Development. This bill won't get to Parliament for the simple reason I was the author of this when I was younger than I was able to know what the hell I was doing. They asked me to write a bill on IT, which I am just surprised it got this far, because it was a lot of nonsense. I didn't know how to write a bill, and I will not see it go to Parliament. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Hans?
Well, I'm Hans van Groenland, engineer IT. Interesting thing is the Minister of Finance in Washington in an interview said that government wants to open or get business moving, right? And as one of them, he says we have to give priority to spectrum. I challenge DTPS today. They said they've never heard them saying that. They're not aware. So there's definitely there's talk going on in different areas, but here at the operating level, I don't think they are part of the discussion.
Just a little aside on the way policies are made, and some people like Luann Grant, for example, is very well experienced in this area, Chose, is that many government departments have their toe in the same pond as others, and that does lead to confusion and miscommunication. I am one of the rare people who think that's a good thing. I like the fact that we have DTI and agriculture and DTPS and finance and justice often disagreeing with each other quite fundamentally about stuff. And to put it bluntly, I'm glad that I live in a country in which that happens, rather than one in which everything is passed down from the top and everyone sings the same song. So let me say that is what I think one of the things we achieved in '94 is that we can have this sort of miscommunication, lack of direction, lack of cohesion. That, in my view, is one of the positives in the new South Africa. So I know that's an unusual view, but I don't like what I see in most other countries where everyone in government is forced to sing the same song. In South Africa, there's a rich discourse that takes place between government departments and agencies on many issues. Yeah.
Thanks. Leon, just in response to your earlier comments about the legal attack on this bill, I think you were honing in there on the rule of law. I saw 2 points that you made. One is certainty and the other one rationality. And I think I agree with you. This is so uncertain in key definitions and provisions that those who are concerned and will be affected by this bill will not be able to plan their lives accordingly, just in very simple terms. The other one, rationality. This would seem to be a very irrational means to achieving a government objective, so I go with that. The other one that I was thinking about is because it is so vague, one can guess immediately that there's going to be a set of regulations. And that, of course, is going to fly in the face of the rule of law, because that will be the rule of man, the minister. And, of course, there's a conflict with the separation of powers doctrine there, because the executive will be writing the laws instead of the legislator writing the laws. So just those thoughts. My real question to you, though, is if this is not just an act of folly and stupidity, what are they really up to?
Okay, we've, I think all of us, Duncan, Adrian, me and others, have been told, as I say, whispering over tea and lunch and in the corridors, that and people get named, individuals, Chose will be familiar with this, who are believed to be behind it and promoting their own very substantial interests in dodgy ways, let's say. I don't want to say more than that. I am the recipient of second, third, fourth-hand information. So, but this is the whisper that takes place everywhere, is that there's essentially high-level corruption, at least behind the white paper. But I'm told that the interests behind the white paper have somehow changed, and it's not quite clear who now really wants this bill reenacting the white paper. So it's quite a messy business. But, you know, when you ask why, I ask why. Why do you want to mess with something that is so extraordinarily successful? Subject to your correct point, let's find a way of bringing the prices down. As I say, tweak it. Find a way of getting it to work better, but don't throw the whole thing out of the window. I'd never get a good answer. I never get a good answer as to why do they want this? Who really wants this and why? It cannot be in the national interest in any sense at all. It just seems, to put it, I'm sorry to say, nuts. I mean, I'd like to be more polite about it, but it makes no sense from a public policy point of view. It does make sense if you assume vested interests and corruption and behind the scenes finagling then. But, you know, is that just another conspiracy theory? Or is it real? I don't know the answer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just one last one, if I may, to follow up on that. In my presentation, which was done very, very quickly, by the way, I pointed out two countries that I'm familiar with, by the way. I've had some business interaction with both of them. Japan does not make ICT policy at all. They have policy. What they do, they develop a strategy. How are we going to solve this problem? Deal with the strategy. If it works, they call it a policy. Now we've got it upside down here. We think the law is going to come to our rescue, or policy is going to come. You can't eat a policy. In actual fact, I think one of my favorite management gurus says that if you want a policy, why don't you try the 10 Commandments? They've been going on for a hell of a long time. But the big issue is this here. When you say bring the prices down, I can tell you right now, that's why I was hoping that Graham from MTN would be here and Vodacom CEO Joosub, you know, they're too busy, these guys here. But you know what you can do? You can provide in deep street, don't have to go too far, in deep or a rural area, if you use the spectrum wisely. But not only the spectrum, move away from individual connectivity. You just mentioned it. People cannot afford that individual uncapped broadband. Do you know what? When I'm old enough to remember when the telephone was first invented, by the way, in the 18th century, but you had public call boxes. This in the world of broadband, you can put a public call box. By the way, there's somebody that can do it right now. Vumatel. Vumatel is saying 100 megabit per second, shared service 20:1 contention ratios in the townships and so forth at 89 Rand a month. Take that 100 megabit per second and let about 20 or 50 children in the locality share that. Guess what? We found a solution, and it can be done tomorrow. We don't have to wait for.
You can probably answer this for me, and let's not do it now. I think we need to move towards closure. But I have a cottage in a small village, and there's no ADSL, there's no fibre there, no Vumatel or anything. But we get from a tower on a hill about 5 miles away, I don't know how this works, by a company I won't name for now. It provides, covers the whole town and the township and the low-income areas, the shanty towns, everything, with mobile broadband at, well, you have to have a dish, sorry, that's important. You have a dish, it's very cheap. The price we pay per month for uncapped 10 megabits per second, we pay 900 Rand. But if we were at something like 2 megs and capped at a lowish level, it would be something like 250 Rand, 200 Rand. So I'm not saying, I'm saying it could be cheaper, but I'm saying that is available right now in an informal settlement in Mpumalanga.
Can we do it and not wait for the government to do it, by the way?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably going off at a tangent, but you know what? I marvel at the discussions as to blaming government for all these, we don't know why they do this and one thing. You guys don't do introspection as to what has happened. In the past 24 years of this government, what has collapsed are thought-leading institutions, you know, Free Market Foundation, Saki, and all of them don't even have the capacity to deal with government. Democracy is a very expensive and messy way of government. Understand? Because what happens is often stakeholders will fight for their own, you know, and there are very powerful stakeholders that are working on this bill, the white paper and that type of thing. But you don't have the countervailing you know, force that is coming from other critical stakeholders like Free Market Foundation. In fact, if you can go and look at the budget of institutions like yourself, they have declined over some time. Understand that? Because when there is nothing like this, people don't pay their monthly subscriptions and all this type of thing. I belong to this main organization. You actually pray for this type of an opportunity to be able to get money and people coming up. Because normally in a democracy, what happens is you've got to constantly be checking what is happening in government. Because the way government is allows you to have access to all the laws that are here, and you can twist them in a way in which they serve you. And if there's no one who's looking for your own interest, you'll either catch it in parliament on when it has happened. And that is why in strong democratic countries, you've got strong forums, organizations, associations, interest groups to ensure that they constantly look at this government is doing, and they are capacitated by companies, you know, to ensure that they're able to do so. It should not have led to this point. The only reason is you can look, I mean, probably the Computer Society of South Africa has been growing because that uses individual members, and of course, but most other organizations are unable to survive and be able to produce the number of all the books that we have behind you. And we've got to do something about it. Because, as I say, I must emphasize, South Africa is not a dictatorship, it's a democracy. And stakeholders have to agitate for their own needs and work very hard, and you need money. In a dictatorship, you don't need money. You just need one guy to bribe, and you get what you want. In our system, it's different. It's an expensive system. So in that way, I'm appealing for all the companies and stakeholders, support your organizations to be able to achieve your objectives.
Could I just say something in response to Chose? He's not just talk, he walks the talk. When he was in a position to do just that, he directed corporate money to us to take on I can't give you more detail, he can if he wants to, we don't have a problem with it, but to take on a government policy that seemed cast in stone. It was finished. Chose saw exactly that in a democracy it's never cast in stone, and he, along with us and others, funded a campaign to combat that policy, and we won completely. It was just buried, and it was also potentially quite serious. So yes, Chose is, you know, I think you're absolutely right, and you have practiced what you preach when he was in a position to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for attending today and staying the course. The next media event is on the 23rd of May, when the Free Market Foundation, together with the Institute of Race Relations, will be looking at expropriation without compensation. So I hope that's something you will make a point of coming along to.